Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to talk through my old 3D printing setup and I'm going to document the new 3D printing workbench build. Stay tuned. This is the current 3D printing setup and I'll talk about why it's not working for me. I have this old table here that doesn't have any storage below or above. I only have this toolbox that keeps my tools, but a lot of things on the table don't have a home. So they just kind of get piled on the table and a lot of times it clutters the space here for me to do any work. This bar cart is the only storage I have for my filament, and I actually have way more filament than what's here. I have some up here, and I have some off camera on the other side of the room. And this cart can only hold 2 of my large printers. I actually have a third small mini here in the house, and I like to get them all in the same spot. So the first thing I need to do is design a workbench that I can incorporate all those things that I need stored away, tucked away clean, so that they all have a home and that I can easily use the table. The other thing is I don't sit in this chair, and oftentimes when I'm here, I'm standing up. So for me, it makes sense to make a standing desk, and that way I can get more storage below.
I spent a week or so playing around in Fusion 360, designing what I think the workbench should be, tweaking the dimensions and moving cubbies around. And this is what I came up with. This will run the length of the wall, as well as be able to store my printers more optimally, one on top of each other, and have room for the spools. And I also took into account the dimensions of the toolbox that I need to put in one of the cubbies, as well as filament storage. I like using Fusion 360 for design work because you could do things parametrically, meaning I could change the length of the bench at any point and everything will kind of move along with it. Once I'm done with the design, I use cutlistoptimizer.com. It's a free website where you can put in all the dimensions of all your pieces, along with what stock sheets you're going to use and the lengths, and it will generate a cut list and lay everything out optimally. You guys should check it out. I use this for almost every project with plywood. It's a really great resource. With the design done and the plywood ordered, I went to the next step of cleaning up the old workstation and beginning to prep the area for the new table. The previous owner of this house had this trim on the wall. I never really liked it, so it's going to be really gratifying to remove it. So the next phase is to get all this trim off, refill and patch the wall, and repaint it. Another reason why I want to get the trim off the walls is because I'm going to be using French cleats on the wall itself. So I want to make sure I don't have any bumps or anything protruding off that would mess with the cleats later on. What you see here is the largest sheet of plywood that I have ever seen, at 10 feet long by 4 feet. In comparison to my shop, it's just over half the length of my shop. And it was definitely a challenge to get it on top of this workbench that I have to break down plywood. Luckily, I have this plywood handle jig that I kind of slip underneath so I could get some leverage to basically lift the whole sheet up. But man, did I think 8 feet sheets were heavy. Just that extra 2 feet. Oh, so heavy.
So I'm at the next phase of the project, which is to break all the pieces down that I need for the workbench. I have all my plywood stacked on top of my sawhorses here with a layer of foam underneath the first layer that I'm cutting. I'm using a Festool track saw, but you can use any track saw. If you don't have a track saw, you could use a circular saw with a straight edge. And I'm following my diagrams here of all the pieces that I need for my build from Cutlass Optimizer. So it took me about 4 hours to cut down all the pieces of wood. I have this stack here and this long table here and that big piece there. In total it was 3 4x8 sheets and 1 4x10 sheet for the large countertop and the French cleats out in the back.
So to join all the boards together, I'm prepping all my faces with pocket holes. This jig here could be bought pretty inexpensively and at almost every big box store. It allows you to drill the hole at an angle, which we call the pocket, and then later on with glue, you're going to tighten up all your joints with a pocket hole screw. So one trim that I didn't take out was the base trim that hides the seam of the floor with that of the wall. So I used this little scribing jig to help me get the profile of that trim, and I'm transferring that onto the base walls of my stand. This is because I want to make sure that I get the table as flush to the wall as possible. Otherwise, I would have this half-inch gap from the table to the wall. And I'm using a coping saw to help me cut that profile out. If you have a jigsaw, you could do that too. This is just my go-to that I like to use. I repeated this process 3 more times as I had 3 basically legs or walls that would be supporting the entire table. And I also didn't show, but I did a ton of pocket holes. This was by far the most satisfying part of the whole build, the actual assembly. So my thought process for this was that the unit was so big that I was going to build it on its side, laying back, and then I'm going to tilt it forward. What I'm using here is a clamps and a 90-degree jig that I 3D printed to help align the walls and to hold it in place while I drill the screws in for the pocket holes. Originally, I was going to glue the whole thing up, but I decided to just glue the points that I thought were structurally needed. And certain parts of the shelves, I just used pocket holes and no glue. That way, in the future, I have the ability to remove them and shift them a little bit higher or lower if I needed to. Also, as I was building this, I kind of built the pieces in a specific order so that the shelves would act as guides to keep things in place so I could fit everything in perfectly and tight. Once assembled, I worked on my most favorite part of any build, sanding. Putting up a French cleat wall is pretty simple. You do need a level of some kind to make sure that everything is nice and horizontal. And I'm using a spacer so I don't have to measure anything out, and I can just use that to guide me on the next one that I'm placing on there. And to secure it to the wall, I am using brad nails because I know I'm not using anything heavy on this wall. I know brad nails are fine, but if it's going to be heavy, I would reinforce it with some kind of screw or wood glue. I didn't record the application of the polyacrylic on it, but we did 3 coats with light sanding in between. Here, I had my wife help me move it into position. She also helped me put it upright when it was on its side when I was doing the assembly. This thing is just so heavy. So the last thing to build are the 3 drawers for the workbench. There are lots and lots of ways of making drawers, loads of YouTube videos out there. They could be really simple or really complicated. For this one, I'm just going super easy, just glue and brad nails holding together. The depth of the drawer is the depth of the box of the drawer is the depth of the drawer itself, but the width of it is actually 1 inch narrower than where the drawer is going to be. That 1 inch tolerance is going to be for the slides that I'm going to be using, as each slide is 1/2 inch thick. Here, what you're seeing me do is cut the fronts and the backs for the box. I'm actually cutting the 2 pieces stacked on top of each other. That way it is perfectly even, and I just make 1 cut for 2 of the pieces. One of the nice things you could do with the track saw. One thing to note when I'm cutting these boxes, the height of my box walls are actually going to be 3/4 of an inch lower than what I want it to be, because the base is going to have that 3/4, which I will cut after I build the box. For the drawers, I'm using glue and brad nails. You could actually get away with just using glue and clamps. Just clamp it together. The brad nails allows me to not have to clamp it together. Also, if you don't want to clamp or you don't have clamps, what you can do is countersink holes, then use a screw to screw it in together. But you want to make sure you drill first with a countersink. That way the plywood doesn't split. So what I'm doing here is double checking that my box is square. So I'm measuring corner to corner to make sure my numbers are right. And then to be extra careful, I'm taking those 90-degree squares that I have and just clamping 2 adjacent corners so that the box will be square all around. So now I'm just measuring the bottom drawer dimension so I can cut out the bottoms, and then we could glue it on once that's dry. With the bottom cut out and the box dried, I can do the fitting and make sure everything looks okay. And then we'll add glue and then just brad nail around. Pretty simple. If there's any uneven squareness, we could even that out with sanding later on. Oh, right, sanding. So after sanding, I move on to putting the rails on the drawer boxes. What I like to do is use multiple combination squares where I kind of set it once and it'll be repeatable and I don't have to remeasure things out, especially if I'm making these things over and over again. So the first combination square you saw was to mark the center line of where the drawer slide was. And the second one was to recess in the rail, not flush to the edge. But for me, I'm using a 3/4 inch front, so I recessed it in 1/4 of an inch, so I get 1 inch, and then that's the spacing that I know that I have from the front of the drawer to the flush with the front of the workbench. So now that the rails are on, I use a third combination square with the rail fully put in to figure out the distance that I'm going to use later on as a guide, so I could put the rail exactly where I need to, at what height. So I'm leaving a little gap here so I make sure that there's spacing between the drawer box and the workbench. To install the mating slide on the workbench itself, I'm using my combination square to mark out where the reference would be for the slide. And the wood piece that I'm using here as like a resting block to make sure everything is horizontal is what I used, what I cut it earlier with the height where I compensated for that small gap. So I use this over and over again to mount the slides on each side, and I just keep repeating the process for the left and the right. And then I also repeat the building process for the box for all of them, as my width of each divider isn't exactly perfectly the same. So I try to make sure I build each box as I'm going instead of building it all as one big group. You can build it as one big group if you're really confident that all your, dividers for your spacing is exactly right. As you can see, I had already moved into the workbench, so there's a lot of clutter and stuff already going on. Because I was waiting for the drawers for one of the slides, so there was a couple of weeks in between where I was waiting. But here, I'm getting ready to make the face frames and marking out the centers of each drawer face. For this next step, I kind of went overkill and used my Shaper Origin to cut out the handles for the drawer faces. You can also use a fret saw or coping saw. Also, you don't have to do the pulls like I did. You could just use a little knob or something. But I don't like knobs because it sticks out. I usually push up against it and it just doesn't feel great. So I'm using hand cut outs. Another reason why I really like doing hand cutouts is because I could clamp the drawer faces like this. Usually, if you you don't have that space to put in a clamp, you have to use double-sided tape. Here, I'm just getting the faces roughly put in. And for the gaps, what I'm using are Uno cards or playing cards or whatever you have to get the spacing. You could do 20 cards, 15 cards, and then use that as each gap. You could also use cards for the vertical gaps, but I was just eyeballing it here and just kind of shifting them back and forth. But if you wanted to be super critical about it, or if you don't have the clamps, I would definitely advise just putting cards in every gap so you have it exactly where you need it, and then putting the face frame on with the double-sided tape. I want to take this time to thank you guys for watching this video. It's a really long one, the longest one I've ever made. I mean, it was a really big project and there was a lot of steps involved. But if you like this, what I'm doing here, and you want to see more, check out my videos. Please subscribe and like the video, and let me know how I did. And if you guys have any ideas how to improve, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.